Hello and welcome to Across the Benches, a political discussion for 2022 with a difference. We're going to try to be positive and swim across a sea of negativity. We'll seek agreement instead of politics being a zero-sum game beloved by some in the news media or some kind of tribal standoff between two entrenched opposing views. We're going to try to focus less on what divides us and talk a bit, at least, about what might bring us together. The challenge for our very independent-minded guests, Labour peer Baroness Shami Chakrabarti and Conservative peer Ken Clarke, Baron Clarke of Nottingham, is to see how we can improve the tone of our politics by considering what we can agree on. For the sceptics and the cynics in our audience, we're not about to hold hands and sing "It's a Small World After All." We're all too aware of what does divide us. But our democracy depends not merely on an unwritten or uncodified constitution, but also on certain norms of behaviour, of respect for and acceptance of facts and truth and election results, and even treating opponents as opponents and not as enemies. So, can we rebuild and repair across the benches? Well, I wanted to begin with some personal thoughts about why you entered party politics, but I have to say, Ken, that the Prime Minister's handling of what's been happening at the Downing Street, the party during coronavirus, is one of the most extraordinary parliamentary events that I have ever seen, and I suspect you've seen. I just wondered what you think of it.
I've seen some pretty ridiculous ones. I've been turning down media invitations the last 2-3 days. I mean, large numbers of them, 3 or 4 today, in order to keep out of this stupid row which is going on. It's quite farcical, I just don't see the point in my joining in that everybody else does. So I do think that the Prime Minister's got himself into one hell of a mess, not for the first time. But there are actually endless more important issues that the country should be confronting, like the economic crisis that we're, I think, going to go into quite soon. And we're certainly in a very difficult situation. We have the odd problems with Mr. Putin and Ukraine and the various parts of the world where the most appalling things are going on. And the British political system is seized with a fantastic row over a party having moved on from wallpaper. And I just think it makes me depressed about the state of politics. One serious point that I do draw from it is it will feed the incredible cynicism that there is in politics, which has got worse in the last 20 years very rapidly, and which really worries me now. The public are quite foolishly cynical about all their politicians. If you put the proposition to most members of the public, does it matter who you vote for? Aren't they all rogues? They're only in it for what they get out of it. About 80% of the public agree with that. Now, actually, I think the motives and the standards of honesty of the vast majority of MPs, there are, of course, a crooked fringe, as there are in any, the 650 people. But for the vast majority of politicians, their standards of honesty and their motives for going into politics are much higher than those amongst the general public. But it does lead to a lot of the anarchy of debate which you were describing when you introduced this, that people now have this unbelievable cynicism. Now, the one thing I will say about the present crisis is, if anything, it could not be better designed to make people hopelessly cynical, anti-politician, disliking the political class, and even more prone to personal, abusive arguments, which are a substitute for a political discussion.
Shami, I suspect you agree with almost all of that, in the sense that you know lots of politicians. I have met dozens and perhaps hundreds of politicians of different parties, and Ken is right with his basic characterization, which is most politicians work extremely hard, give up quite a lot in order to be in politics. But this makes the whole system look terrible.
It does. And I think I think the key principle for me is kind of, well, we'll go on to talk about this, but one of the things that I have in common with Ken, I believe, apart from liking him and him having always been very kind and encouraging to me over the last 20 odd years since I came into public life, I think we share a belief in the rule of law. And I'm not citing that to get into what's happening in number 10 parties or whatever. I think it's relevant to cynicism in politics and trust in institutions, because yes, I know lots of decent people in political life and politicians and so on, but they have to show the same respect and mercy and kindness towards ordinary people when they err, as you would expect to show. So, for example, in my adult life, I've heard, people being really nasty about people who benefit scroungers and antisocial behaviour. I've seen all sorts of conduct that used to be considered a more minor infraction or misdemeanours become something rather more serious. But I've seen a much more punitive approach, not just to political combat, but to how we treat people who've erred, not in political life, but in normal life. Now, we've had over 20 years of that sort of authoritarian arms race about, as I say, people on benefits, naughty children. We've seen a criminalisation and a harsher criminalisation of all sorts of behaviour, and we've got bills going through Parliament at the moment that would, criminalise peaceful dissent, etc., etc. You can't do that to ordinary citizens, and then when you err in political life or in other parts of elite institutional life, not expect them to say, hang on a minute, and that's where this kind of sense of, a distrust in institutions comes from. For years and years and years, people felt, I think, that politicians were wagging the finger at them for every minor misdemeanour, which was now going to incarcerate more people and criminalise more people. And then, of course, you have the MP's expenses scandal. You have the banking crisis that was in part caused by some not very good practices in financial institutions. We had the Iraq War, where people felt that those leading the government weren't always straightforward about the case for that. And it may seem odd that I'm making this connection, but underneath all of this, I'm saying there's got to be some sense of a rule of law and fundamental values that bind everybody. Now, bind them in a positive sense, that they share the values, but also that will be applied to them equally.
And can I take it you accept that you do share very many common values about wanting the best for the country, justice, the rule of law, and so on?
We have politics as we have disagreement. The idea that you can get everybody to agree on any political issue is nonsense. And people do have their natural instincts, which, put in political terms, tends to make them right of centre or left of centre. And Shami and I don't agree on everything because she is left of centre and I'm right of centre. The values, I think, we all have to have in common in a society like ours. So the values and appreciation of things like honesty, and putting the national interest first and all that kind of thing, that unites politicians. And what the politicians should do is debate, ferociously if they like, the important issues of the day to help steer public opinion. But they should debate with respect for those they disagree with and all the rest of it. Now, on the question of why it's all fallen into disrepute, and it's not only in the United Kingdom. I mean, none of the Western democracies are working properly, not in the way they were 30 years ago. I've forgotten what it is. The reason it's fallen into dispute is the occasional scandal and the reaction to it. I do think the MP's expenses scandal, which Shami mentioned, had a big impact in this country. Now, you can mitigate that. The number of MPs who were seriously involved was about 20 or 30, well over 600, hadn't claimed anything they weren't entitled to. But it did tar the whole system, and then it was built on after that. But it's not an explanation of why political debate now it has become so personalised. It's partly the celebrity culture, poisonous celebrity culture. So all the leading politicians become national celebrities. So every feature of their private life and everything they do, therefore, is 24 hours, 7 days a week, subject to scrutiny. And a lot of people prefer arguing in terms of personalities rather than the more complicated and dull business of discussing the merits of the issue. And that is growing and growing. Again, I'm trying to, there's absolutely no point in my turning down ITV, The World at One, the M programme, and one or two others, and then coming along and giving you sort of headlines here by giving you minor headlines, silly headlines, by giving you my candid views on what's going on at the moment, I will say it is farcical. I mean, the whole thing is, we haven't had quite such a silly series of rows of this kind, but actually, although it goes to the heart of the system that MPs should follow higher standards than other people, try to, because they're going to be vulnerable, and that MPs should certainly follow the rules that they themselves are laying down for the general public. I don't think that's, they're difficult propositions to set out. The whole thing, let's face it, what everybody's loving about it is the personalities and the rather farcical knockabout feature of the whole debate that's gripping the government.
That goes to the core of it, though, doesn't it? Because we have had in Donald Trump a president of the United States who rose because he was a figure on television. And we have in our country a prime minister, at least he was when we started our conversation, who made it as a personality on television and wrote witty columns.
People like big theatrical personalities, in the States and here particularly, but it's a danger of it growing elsewhere, big, larger-than-life theatrical personalities and arguing about them and their character and their private life or anything else that comes up, because I think our media must share some of the blame. The media find that much easier to report, and you don't get discussions on policy now on the media. The producers regard it as boring, and they think their audience want to listen. And none of the parties have got any policies on anything.
I think there's something to that, and I think there's something to that. I'm cautious not to be Trumpian by saying the media, and I know that's not what you mean, but I think Ken's onto something which is often these days when I read political journalists or listen to political commentators, they seem to be talking about politics as if they are sports pundits or theatre critics. So who had a good day, who had a bad day, whose currency's up, whose currency's down, who landed a blow, which, but too much of that means then that politics is being framed as a night at the theatre or a boxing match, and I don't hear the interest from political journalists in as Ken said, genuine, detailed debates about policy or even underlying philosophy.
The present Prime Minister responds to that by devoting quite a large part of most working days to travelling, either in a helicopter or occasionally on a train, for about 20 minutes to some distant part of the country for the day's photo opportunity. And that is regarded as, obviously by his entourage regard that as a key part of being Prime Minister. And his entourage in number 10 run the whole thing mainly on the principle that they're fighting a permanent general election campaign for the opinion polls, as oppositions invariably do. But nowadays, both sides do it. I mean, through the Blair government as well. And you were fighting a permanent... Now, in my day, I'm an old goffer saying it's not what it was, but the first 2 or 3 years of a parliament, you actually did what you came into politics for, which is trying to work out what the national interest was, how your particular beliefs, you thought you were going to make the country a bit of a better place, and how you might occasionally be able to make a bit of a difference to that personally by doing something. Anybody like that's regarded as dull now. I mean, they wouldn't.
I could probably fairly quickly encapsulate what I have in common with Ken and where I disagree without speaking at length. I think that Ken Clarke believes in human rights and the rule of law.
Yeah, sure.
And I think he's got a proven record. I'll never forget him going out as Justice Secretary relatively recently in his very long long and eminent career defending the Human Rights Act when his colleagues in the cabinet were saying that you have to trash the Human Rights Act because people are getting to stay here because they have cats. And Ken went out without fear or favour and said this is nonsense, etc., etc. So I have no doubt in my mind that, yes, he's a nice person and he's not personal and he's not nasty and he's quite fun to be with, but we have a certain core belief in fundamental human rights and the rule of law. That said, he said it, I'm to the left, he's to the right, so we will disagree, for example, about things like private prisons.
Yes,
right, which is an interesting one because it's sort of rule of law territory, but it's where rule of law territory and then the socio-economic left-right divide come into a clash. He was a bit of an enthusiast for private prisons. I think they're a really bad idea, and look at America if you see potentially where you get with profit for incarceration, but we can have that discussion. He's not interrupting me, he's not calling me names. It's kind of an interesting I've never not had an interesting discussion about politics or policy with him.
How then does the Justice Secretary get on with Shami in her previous job as running Liberty and a few?
I mean, on the point, the thing we strongly both agree in, we always agreed from the first moment we started dealing with each other, is on the rule of law, but also we have very liberal views on criminal justice. We both believe that the aim of criminal justice is to punish, you have to, but in a way which is civilized, and at the same time the main aim is to stop them offending again, which means you look at rehabilitation, how actually you can tackle them, and what's the best way of punishing them, and that's likely to lead to them getting back to a normal life and not reoffending. So that's criminal justice. Now, Shami, for years, founded and ran the leading NGO on the subject. Well, there we are. It was undoubtedly the leading NGO on the subject. And Shami campaigned, in a way she was campaigning against my government, but in fact she wasn't campaigning against me. I agreed with all that. And I had two goes at the Home Secretary. Now, on the other hand, I'm a One Nation Tory, and I do disagree with the Labour Party, and I believe in free markets combined with a social conscience. Now, I think private prisons improve the way you run the prisons if you control it properly, because it means you bring in different people. The more variety you have of approaches to the management, the more you can challenge the way you do things. And some of the private prisons were very successful, some were very unsuccessful. In talking about what the good prisons were and the bad prisons were, in my opinion, it has nothing to do with whether they're private sector or public sector. I took the same view in health.
But that's to go to your point, Shami. But you have fundamental values that are the same, but we live in a culture now where I think we might all agree that values are what divides so many people, and which is why the so-called culture wars, why these issues are so intractable, and also it's not just personalities appearing on television. It is that these issues are very, very difficult to resolve because they're not about cutting an economic cake, effectively. Is that fair? And is that why politics is so nasty?
There's a bit of that, isn't there? Because there's a bit of that, yes. There's a politics of personal destruction. And
caused all that? I had no idea.
Well, maybe social media has helped the demise of polite discourse. I know that's what everybody says that, and so I'm not saying anything terribly original. And I'm a refusenik. I'm a tin hatter. I have no footprint on social media platforms. I just don't do it. And I know that that's not an option that's open.
You have bogus ones in your name.
No. Oh yes, a parody account. Yeah. But I don't have sleeper. I don't call myself, Ken Clarke to spy on people on Twitter. No. I think that some of these platforms have actually been designed to reward people and give them more dopamine hits for being as controversial, and that means hateful and personal. And of course, politics is not divorced from social media. Politicians are spending as much time sometimes on their Twitter accounts as they are speaking in the chamber, and that's not helped. I mean, it's not the whole story, but you've got this politics of personal destruction. It's not enough to debate, it's not enough to disagree, it's not enough to dismiss. You have to truly annihilate the person opposite.
And it's not confined to Britain either.
And I'm afraid it doesn't suit, it's too rich for my, I'm a bit too herbivorous for that.
I thought it was all golfers like me who blame social media.
I'm not blaming, I'm just saying it is a contributory factor.
But the other thing that's changed, the public's approach to politics has changed a lot. It's become more personal, more concerned about what's the effect on me. One reason why politics was so civilized, comparatively, when I first, say when I started following it as well as a small child at school, it was because most of the voters were quite tribal. 80% of the population, as I found when I first started campaigning, when I got into my 20s, they would tell you, yeah, so I always vote Labour. We're a Labour household here. We always have. And my father voted Tories. I'm a Tory, and we all vote Tory. And it was partly the class divide. It was also deference. There was great deference, and I don't want the deference to come back. I'm glad that's vanished. Now we're all individuals. And people just don't conform to any club opinions. They have their own opinions, which are sometimes ferociously. One narrow subject will get people to express very strong views. And the voting patterns across the country have almost reversed themselves. I mean, the red wall seats were aging, angry, working class voters who, the same people a generation earlier, were absolutely solid followers of the working class movement, blue collar voters. Their heirs are angry. They hate London, they hate the establishment, they hate all bloody politicians, they hate foreigners, they hate immigrants, and they're casting a protest vote. Meanwhile, in southern England, in Cheshire and Amersham, where it was a silly question to ask the vast majority of the population who they're voting for, the Tories go and lose that. Admittedly, a more political protest by people who were previously moderate Tories. Yeah, that was a more political thing. I think there were Tories like me expressing anger that the party had gone to the right.
I only feel the need to sort of. I'm sure that Ken is not suggesting that that people progressing in their families and going to university and women's empowerment, because when the bloke when you first knocked on those doors and the bloke said this is a Labour household or a Tory household, Mrs. Bloke may have had her own, etc. There are all sorts of.
She kept them to herself.
Indeed.
The quality of life in this country and its values have improved in many respects.
Exactly.
I'm not some old boy saying.
And I also don't want to. I know you don't want to caricature either Amersham or the Red Wall or whatever. But Ken's got a point that periods of change can be traumatic, can be turbulent, and it is the job of political leadership to try and harness that change and show leadership by example that change and even that revolution, and I don't mean violent revolution, but I mean things like technological revolution and so on, can be handled in a decent sort of civilized fashion. And I don't want to say that I'm against the internet, because it's been such a democratizing thing, but at the same time it's been, if you like, colonized in ways that are incredibly profitable for these tech billionaires, but are actually designed to cause sometimes conflict rather than consensus.
I bring in another area which has come up slightly from some of our audience, but also I've just come back from Northern Ireland, and somebody over there said to me, many people here did not like Mrs. Thatcher, but you knew what you were getting because she didn't lie to people. And there's so many lies in politics. And they were talking about Ulster politics, but also politics more widely. Is that one of our problems, Ken, that we had divisions before, But Mrs. Thatcher, who wasn't liked by everybody, you knew what you were getting. And you got pretty much what she said you were going to get.
Yeah, well, Mrs. Thatcher, Mrs. Thatcher's quality was she knew exactly what she wanted to do in politics. She didn't hold back in making that clear. She was always prepared to argue it. And although I never of her wing of the party, and I had terrible rows with her sometimes, all she ever did was promote me. Yeah, all she ever did was promote me. But underlying it all, and I think, together with Attlee, they're the two greatest prime ministers we've had since the war. They actually changed society. And all sorts of mythology has now been constructed by Thatcherites and anti-Thatcherites around the Thatcher government. But amongst other things, she never read a newspaper. Bernard used to do a digest for her every day, but it was only showing her favourable things, not things that might upset her. And she took no notice of opinion polls. I mean, to start arguing with her on the basis we can't do this, Margaret, the polls show 60% are against it. I mean, every strike we ever fought, the public wanted us to settle after about the first week.
Do you think that, Shami, that there are more lies and deceit now? We've seen it in America, where the Washington Post, reckoned that Donald Trump told 20,000 lies, they use the word, in the presidency or more. I mean, is that one of the things which has changed in our politics? It has become... not everybody tells the truth all the time. We all tell lies occasionally. But that for many of our listeners, what has changed is there's a great deal more deception.
Look, I want to be careful about saying it was always wonderful and now it's all terrible, because I can't, and even as I've been agreeing with Ken, I've been thinking, hang on a minute, if you read a bit of Victorian politics, or, I mean, there'll be historians listening to this who'll go, hang on a minute, I remember, people were heckled, Churchill would have been heckled in certain...
It started over 100 years.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's about time it stopped.
So we've got to be...
For a long time.
Let's be careful about, the halcyon days when working people didn't even have the vote in this country, and women certainly didn't. And wouldn't it be great if we went back to that? That would be a mistake. But I think we're at a particular point where, on the one hand, there's globalization and democratization and 24-hour media and all the exciting potential of that, but also some people who are totally shameless about how they harness that opportunity, but also it's a bit, on the one hand things are opaque, on the other hand they're incredibly transparent. And so somebody like Donald Trump, let's not be too close to home, let's talk about Donald Trump, because he was over there and for the moment at least he's no longer in office. The shamelessness, not just of his contempt for the American Constitution and the rule of law and democratic elections, but his attitude towards women, towards opponents, really is beyond a certain pale of anything that we kind of aspire to in democracies.
And he did lie, which is, again, has always been, serious lies.
And then you accuse your opponents of fake news.
He mixed up his business interests with his politics.
So it's corruption.
And it showed what went wrong. The people who supported him, the more redneck Americans who were, again, hostile to politicians and the establishment, they could see that Donald wasn't one of those. And he because his personality was such, there was a section of the population that shrugged their shoulders and say, "Oh, that's Donald, isn't he?" Lad, which is reflected on this side of the Atlantic as well. I mean, I think actually the public have always taken this. That's why Lloyd George's private life did nothing really, not seriously, to damage his political standing. Winston Churchill was not his drinking habits. People so admired them, they were prepared to shrug them off, but they were both big political figures, whereas Trump certainly not. And the other thing that's happening, which we haven't got onto, is the polarizing of opinion. I mean, leaving aside the nasty extremes, who I would leave out all this mutual respect and so on, racists and so on. No, you're not polite to those, and you don't, you just refuse to contemplate certain opinions. But otherwise, it is no doubt that the far higher proportion of the public, now they make their own mind up and don't vote tribally, are moving either to the hard right or to the hard left. Makes both our political parties practically unmanageable. And it also means, as both political parties have been so foolish as to hand over the real power to whoever pays a subscription and becomes a member of the party, that you polarize. You wince at that. The result is the public are presented with a choice of Jeremy Corbyn or Boris Johnson. That was the best the party political system could do at the last election, who apparently were thought to be suitable people and personalities to be Prime Minister, which struck me as surprising at the time.
But I mean, the big point that comes through in so many of the questions that come into us is, how do you rebuild trust in some kind of way in British politics? And is that partly about personalities? There's individuals like Boris Johnson who needs to go and that would help, or is there something much more structural?
Well, I do. I mean, I don't want to upset Ken, who's avoiding all these interviews and so on. But I do think we've got a particular problem and a general problem. So I do think that whilst Ken says I'm not interested in wallpaper and parties, and I appreciate that, we've not mentioned the pandemic. And the pandemic, in many ways, I don't generally like war metaphors in politics. I would say that sort of Nixon's war on drugs fed mass incarceration in the United States. I didn't approve of the ongoing war on terror. I think that the war metaphors are generally a bad idea. However, I would say that actually the COVID-19 pandemic, in many respects, has been more like a world war than either of those two so-called wars. Yeah, and so the reason why this silly party, as you put it, in number 10 matters more, arguably, even than redecoration of flats and so on, is because of the people who could not be with their dying relatives, because of the people who were vulnerable in lockdown, because of the most enormous sacrifice that was. And of course, Mr. Johnson has always tried to be Churchill. And Churchill is beloved of many in the United Kingdom for being the wartime leader who was going to get people through, and people made sacrifices, but there would be sunny uplands on the other side, including human rights and so on. And of course, Attlee says, well, actually, we'll have a bit more equality as well. The parties in gardens matter and aren't silly because of that. Because this is the person who was going on TV every night telling people to stay at home, telling people that they couldn't see their loved ones and so on, and that's why, that unfortunately is why it matters. Now that's the particular problem for the time being. But I also think, and maybe Ken and I would disagree about this, that if you have wider and wider and wider inequality in any society, it will be hard to pull this kind of caravan together, this kind of consensus, and then you and I will look increasingly like liberal elites who are out of touch with people facing real hardship.
We are at the moment in a detached liberal elite. The people who disagree with what we're saying on things will listen to us and say we both belong to the liberal elite, which on left and right is a bit homeless at the moment politically, and there are masses of them, but we are outnumbered by the general population. I do agree with you that one of the things is rarely mentioned is a rapidly increasing divide between the wealthy and the poor. And obviously, when you talk about the extremely wealthy and the very poor, that becomes quite shameful at times. But actually, there is a section of the population that has thrived until when the economy was doing well, until the financial crash, and got better off. The quality of life of everybody is much higher than it was a generation ago. But there's a great lot of the population that haven't benefited much. And the divides are coming back. Those of us who believe in capitalism with a social conscience have got to find some ways of making sure that you don't just rely on some trickle-down effect, and you do ensure that things are properly properly evened up. And the other thing that Shami's already mentioned as well, which I'm just briefly agreeing without repeating here, things are changing so rapidly. The technological revolution and the pace of change has accelerated for the last 200 years. It's now becoming breathtaking, the pace of train. And if you're reasonably prosperous and comfortable and secure, you enjoy it and you benefit from it. But that's a minority of the population. Yeah. And one reason people are reacting in this crazy and unpleasant way to political debate nowadays is, I think, because they just can't cope with the pace of change. I mean, the Brexit vote, for example, it was partly, let's go back to the good old days when we ran ourselves. It was so much better before all these things started changing. Well, this is a very, very strange image to me of the 1960s and the 1950s, which I do indeed remember. But it's, the pace of change can't be coped with. And we're not doing enough to make sure that people see the benefits of change are spread fairly.
And again, the pandemic exacerbated all of that. Yes. Because when people have to stay, work from home if you can, well, who can and who can't? And what are the costs of, if you're locked down with a nice home and garden, or you're by the seaside and not in the, it's a better experience for you.
You can work from a nice cottage in the Cotswolds.
Indeed. Yes. And so so that this period of the last couple of years is exacerbated, and even it's like a parable for inequality on our planet and in our country. And I think whilst we will agree about reasonable discourse and civil liberties and human rights, we have to understand that this basic inequality is getting worse.
Just to bring some of these threads together, at the heart of it, isn't this rather confusing world that we all live in, the pace of change that we all agree is increasing? It's very difficult to cope with it. So therefore, we don't really know what to do about coronavirus. We don't really know about a lot of these things, but we do understand some basic things about the rule of law and about people having parties when they perhaps shouldn't, and about wallpaper that costs £850 a roll. So even though they may seem trivial, they're things that we can understand, which is why the public reacts so badly.
Well, the public aren't that bothered about the wallpaper. They just go on about the cost of it. Now, actually, the wallpaper is more serious than the party. I mean, the party was said to be socialist. I'm not going to defend the damn party, but they were trying to be socially distanced, and I bet it's not the only office in the country that's had a party out in the garden. The wallpaper thing, whether you approve of expensive wallpaper or not, is absolutely a matter of no interest to me at all. For the Prime Minister to take large cash gifts from a businessman, even from an honest businessman, is a pattern that I'd rather not see repeated, and which should not occur, because you're going to get the false impression, I think, in the case of Lord Brownlow, that if he ever gets into trouble with the authorities in any way, he'll expect a favour in return. Now, that aspect of the wallpaper, the media weren't interested in that. That's boring. The media wanted to tell you what colour it was and who the designer was and how much it cost to roll and all that, which, again, you've led me astray here. I have decided personally I've not been interested in giving interviews about for the last several weeks.
We've had a crisis of trust in so democracy requires institutions. And not just democracy, civilized society, advanced societies require institutions, whether they're banking institutions, political institutions, they are necessary. And in the last 20-ish years, a bit less actually, we've seen major crises of trust in major institutions. Banking system, parliament, the executive, even
media, big business,
the police, I'm sorry to say. And we haven't I don't think we've fixed any of those crises of trust in institutions, partly because we've not respected proper separations of power between those institutions, and we've not fixed any of that, and that crisis of trust will undermine our democracy.
I agree. I have to say, I agree with every word you've said, and we're rather short of solutions to us. As a traditional, ages semi-retired politician, I just hope that somehow we could get another, not Churchill like it everywhere, but some other great political statesman is going to emerge who can take control of this and handle it. We haven't produced many in the Western world. In Europe, the best politician of the last 25 years, and a great heroine of mine, is Angela Merkel. She made one terrible mistake when she became excessively liberal, which is not surprising. Well, she let in 1 million people at once. After that, it was time to go. She lost it. But otherwise, she politically, it was a very fine gesture and all that, very humanitarian. But the idea that German society could take that was a terrible mistake. But anyway, Angela Merkel was almost the last one. And I think more and more countries, in where you've got PR, opinion fragments, and you get lots of little parties, several of which are very nasty and extremely unwilling to work with anybody else. It's just we haven't produced the people and the systems that can cope with it and get us back to a more civilized and constructive level of political
But
debate.
I think it needs to be systemic. I don't believe in the great individual, the great man or great woman theory of history that much. Well, I think one of the challenges. No. I think one of the challenges we have is that increasingly really important centres of power are not actually in Westminster at all. So during the Brexit debate, it's like take back control, and I want this passport rather than that passport. Actually, take back control from who? From Google, from Facebook, from Apple, from some of these companies are way more powerful than government.
Well, the present government regards itself as answerable to the Daily Mail, the Daily Express, and the Daily Telegraph, and the Sun. And they're far more accountable to them than they are to Parliament. Parliament has actually allowed most of its powers to be eroded since I first joined.
So people have been told we're going to take back control from Brussels, but it's not even Brussels where a lot of the power is.
No one knew what they wanted.
But I would like to see a 1945 type moment coming out of this pandemic. I would like to see a look at not just at institutions domestically, but internationally. I think we've failed globally in relation to COVID so far.
I thought in the 1990s we were all going marvellously. I really did believe that the world, I thought it was fantastic. We were fall of the Soviet Union. We were having a globalized economy with a rules-based international order. That all these countries were beginning to emerge from poverty where they were successful, usually with free market type reformers like Deng Xiaoping. And I fondly imagined that as they emerge to trade with us and deal with us and raise their living standards, they get more like our society and they liberalize their society and all this. And right now, just to get this whole conversation even more gloomy, this is collapsing on a global scale. The rules, we prefer Cold Wars. We identify our enemies and we make sure we're going to be enemies with them.
Well, I was going to say I've had the privilege of talking to quite a lot of Russians recently, and one said to me, we did the cruelest thing to you in the 1990s. We denied you of an enemy, which kept us all together in a different way.
Well, now we're trying to. The Chinese regime is appalling. I had a lot of dealings in office with the Chinese, trying to develop trade properly, build on from WTO membership, get them to obey the WTO rules, open up for investment, all this kind of thing. I thought proper dialogue with China could only improve things. Privately, I would say to myself, remember, they're all thugs, which they undoubtedly were then, the dominant ruling class. But some of them were very civilized, and you could have constructive discussions. Now we find it more comfortable to say we're going back to a Cold War. We need a Cold War. The Cold War's China. And we should maintain dialogue with the civilized Chinese who are out there. And only by retaining dialogue and respecting them in the international order, which they very much want, can you influence them to actually perhaps move nearer to our values in their treatment of minorities, for example.
But Cold Wars and Hot Wars are good business for some people, are they not?
It's easier to explain and fight and win votes with.
Divide and conquer and make a few quid as well. Be an arms manufacturer, be an arms dealer.
Good for business.
Yeah.
I don't use that. It just means
Of course you don't.
it's politically. You can sell it to your. I mean, going back to Law and Order, which the one subject which you and I almost entirely agree on, making us fairly exceptional in your party and mine. But Tony Blair, I read his memoirs, was amused by my liberal views. He wished to prove he was tough on law and order. That New Labour had to get rid of this stuff about being soft. And Gordon Brown gave him a slogan which meant nothing, but which he used against me. Or about the details, otherwise he posted. And then once they got into office, I mean, they did appalling things. He entered into an arms race to show that with indeterminate sentences, they could be much tougher on crime than the Tories.
I don't know if you heard, but my noble friend David Blunkett has been making speeches now in the House of Lords about what a mistake these indeterminate.
He was a great supporter when I abolished indeterminate sentences. They had a hell of a job getting through.
He also made a speech.
Blair would have opposed it like mad.
He also made a speech the other day, speaking up for refugee rights, quoting W.H. Auden Refugee Blues in response to what Priti Patel wants to do now.
David, realised almost instantly that it wasn't working as he intended. So when I had a hell of a job persuading David Cameron to let me abolish them. Unfortunately, I couldn't get him to agree to any sensible arrangements for what we did with the thousands we'd already got in the prisons. Now, the Labour Party would have shown they were tough on crime, would have voted against, whipped against anyway, the abolition of these marvellous indeterminate sentences. I would have found real trouble in Parliament. But for David Blunkett, the person who'd enacted them in the first place, he openly came out and spoke in favour of abolition.
But this is the thing, you need to give people space to do the right. You need to give people the safe space to do the difficult things without being shot down in flames. So you need to de-escalate these arms races on policy, but also sometimes with the tone of the discourse.
Well, we're running out of time, but I'm going to leave it on this optimistic, happy note. Harmonious note. We are all actually singing now the same hymn sheet. Ken Clarke, Shami Chakrabarti, thank you very much. Thank you.